She had walked through the servants' entrance of Thornvale House 17 times in the past month before she stopped counting. It was easier that way. Easier not to think about the fact that she had once come through the front door, had once stood in the entrance hall while the housekeeper took her coat with both hands and a small bow. That was before her father's death, before the lawyers arrived with their papers and their careful expressions, before she understood that the word illegitimate could erase a person as cleanly as chalk wiped from a board. Her name was Lettice Ashborne. She was 23 years old, and she had grown up in this house. Now she wore a gray dress that did not fit her properly and carried a basket of pressed linens from the laundry up the back stairs, and no one looked at her twice. The position of house assistant had been easy enough to obtain. Mrs. Holbrook, the housekeeper, was a practical woman who needed capable hands and did not ask many questions of a woman who arrived with a composed face and a modest reference letter. Lettice had written the letter herself. Metis, she was not proud of this. She had told herself it was necessary, and she had believed it at the time, and some days she still did. What she needed was access. What she needed was the study on the second floor, where her father's original will, the one that preceded the document the solicitors produced after his death, might still be hidden in the drawer of the old campaign desk. She had seen him put papers there. She had seen him lock it. She remembered the sound of the key. What she had not anticipated was the Duke of Halverton returning from the continent 3 weeks after she arrived. She heard about it from the kitchen. She was sitting at the long table eating her supper with the others, when Aggie, one of the chambermaids, young and easily excited, came through the back door with her eyes wide and her cap crooked on her head. "He's coming," Aggie said. "His Grace. They had a letter this morning from London. He arrives Thursday." The cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Pott, did not look up from the pot she was stirring. "Then we have 3 days to get the east wing aired and the silver polished, and I'd thank you to close the door behind you." "But he's been gone 2 years," Aggie said, as though this explained why the door should remain open. "People come back," Mrs. Pott said. "Door." Aggie closed it. She sat down across from Lettice, with the breathless energy of someone who has information and intends to distribute it generously. "They say he went to Rome after the peace was signed. Then to Florence, then somewhere in Portugal, I think. 2 years, can you imagine? Everyone thought he'd marry Lady Farrow before he left." Lettice kept eating. She knew who Lady Farrow was. Everyone in the county knew. Thea Farrow, Dorothea properly, though no one called her that, was the eldest daughter of Lord Farrow of Keswick Hall, and she had been as good as engaged to the Duke of Halverton since the previous summer. There had been an understanding between the families. There had been a great deal of careful language in the county about the understanding, and Lettice had heard most of it because she had still been Lettice Ashborne of Thornvale, then the daughter of the house, invited to the same dinners and garden parties where these things were discussed in low voices near the window. "He'll want to see her straight away, I expect," Aggie said. "Lady Farrow married," said one of the footmen, without looking up. He was called Dawes, and he gave the impression of someone who had already heard this conversation several times and found it no more interesting than he had the first time. Aggie stared. She didn't. August last year. Colonel Pendry of Dorset. There was a notice in the papers. Aggie looked slightly deflated, as though someone had returned a gift she had been looking forward to giving. "Does His Grace know?" "Not my business to tell him," Dawes said. Lettice put down her fork and looked at the wall. She thought, 2 years is a long time to be gone. She thought, Thursday. She thought about the study on the second floor and the campaign desk, and how much easier everything had been when the Duke was in Portugal. He arrived on a Wednesday, a day early, in a traveling carriage that came up the drive at 4:30 in the afternoon, while Lettice was carrying an armload of curtains to the airing cupboard. She saw him from the upstairs window of the corridor. He was taller than she remembered, from the handful of occasions she had met him before. At dinner at the Pharaohs, once at a charitable concert in the village, once briefly in her father's library, when she had come in without knocking, and found the two of them standing over a map on the desk. The Duke had stepped back then, had bowed slightly, had said something politely forgettable. She had curtsied and retreated and thought nothing more of it. He looked from this distance as though something about him had tightened, not in an unpleasant way. He stood beside the carriage while his man directed the unloading of his trunks, and his stillness was the stillness of someone who had learned, somewhere, to stop spending movement on things that did not require it. Mrs. Holbrook greeted him on the steps. Lettice watched her say something. She watched him nod once. She turned away from the window and carried the curtains to the airing cupboard and told herself quite firmly that none of this concerned her. The house changed with him in it. Not dramatically, not in ways that could be easily pointed to, but the rhythms shifted. Meals at different hours, the library used in the evenings, requests for particular things, a specific kind of paper, a certain ink, the fire in the morning room lit before 8 o'clock. The staff moved a little more carefully, attentive to sounds from particular rooms. Lettice moved carefully too, but for different reasons. She had not gained access to the study. The campaign desk was there. She had confirmed it on her second day, slipping in while the room was empty, and standing very still for a moment, looking at it across the room, noting the small brass lock on the lower right drawer. But the study was used, now. The Duke worked there in the mornings. She would have to wait. She was good at waiting. She had been waiting for 8 months, since the lawyers had arrived and read out the document that said her father's estate passed in its entirety to the nearest male relative, a cousin, Mr. Pruitt Thatch, who lived in York and had visited Thornvale perhaps 4 times in his life, and stood in the entrance hall afterward, looking at the ceiling with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Lettice had stood on the stairs and watched him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Not yet. The nearest male relative, with prior claim, superseding all natural daughters in the absence of a valid testament of contrary intention. She had been over those words many times. She knew, she believed she knew, that there had been a prior will. Her father had spoken of it, not directly, not with the frankness she wished for now. He had been a man who preferred implication to declaration. But he had said, once, sitting at the campaign desk with the lamp low and a glass of port at his elbow, "You will be looked after, Lettice. I have seen to it." He had patted the drawer. He had changed the subject. She was here to find what was in that drawer. She saw the Duke properly for the first time 10 days after his arrival, in the corridor outside the morning room. She was carrying a tray of tea things back to the kitchen, navigating the narrow section near the linen closet when he came around the corner, and they nearly collided. She stepped back sharply. The tray tipped, a cup slid, and she caught it with both hands, steadying the tray against her forearm, and stood very still with her heart going fast and her face arranged into what she hoped was composure. "Careful," he said, not unkindly, simply observationally. "Your Grace." She dipped her chin. Not quite a curtsy, her arms were full. "Forgive me." He looked at her for a moment the way people look when they are trying to place something. "Are you new?" he said. "Relatively, Your Grace. I came in November." He seemed to file this away without particular interest. "Is Mrs. Holbrook about? I need to speak with her regarding the arrangements for next week. I believe she's in the linen room, Your Grace. Second corridor, left at the top of the stairs." He nodded once and moved past her, and that was that. She stood for a moment in the corridor, after he had gone, the tray balanced in her arms, and breathed. She had been afraid, she realized, that he would know her, that something in her face or bearing would strike him as familiar, would remind him of the girl who had been present at those dinners, who had sat 3 places down from him at Lord Pharaoh's table and said almost nothing the entire evening. But she had been unremarkable. She knew this about herself without bitterness. She had always been the quieter daughter, the one who listened, the one who could enter a room and leave it again without disturbing the composition of the scene. It had seemed a deficiency once. Now she thought it might have been a kind of preparation. She learned things over the following weeks in the way that servants learn things, through proximity and silence, through being present and unobtrusive and patient in the way that the household's rhythms required. She learned that the Duke did not eat much at breakfast, that he took his coffee black, that he was in the habit of working until past midnight and could be heard. On still evenings, pacing the study floor, she learned that he had brought back several cases of books from the continent, that he had a slight limp that was barely noticeable and that he never mentioned, that he received letters regularly from someone in London whose handwriting was angular and cramped, and which he sometimes read twice before putting them down. She also learned, because Mrs. Holbrook mentioned it to cook and Lettice happened to be refilling the salt cellars at the far end of the kitchen at the time, that Lady Pharaoh, the former Lady Pharaoh, Mrs. Colonel Pendry now, had sent a note. Audacity, cook said, and returned to her pastry. She wanted to call, Mrs. Holbrook said. She made it sound as though everything were perfectly natural. What did he say? He said he supposed she might. Cook paused in her rolling. And she came yesterday afternoon. She sat with him for half an hour in the drawing room. Margaret said. Margaret, being the parlor maid, she could hear the silence from the hallway. What kind of silence? Mrs. Holbrook seemed to consider this. A very uncomfortable one, she said. Lettice finished with the salt cellars and carried them back to the shelf. She saw Mrs. Pendry herself, 2 days later, coming up the drive again in a carriage with the Pendry crest. The former Lady Pharaoh was a handsome woman in her late 20s, with very good posture and the manner of someone who had been told, often enough to believe it, that she was of considerable consequence. She descended from the carriage in a dark green pelisse and tilted her chin upward slightly as she crossed to the steps, and Lettice, watching from the upper hall window, thought, she still expects something. She thought about what that would be like. To expect things. To arrive at the door of a man whose understanding you had dissolved by marrying someone else during his 2-year absence, and still carry yourself as though the account between you remained open. It was possible, Lettice supposed, that Mrs. Pendry regretted the marriage. It was possible that she had thought the Duke would come back diminished, and the Colonel had seemed, at the time, the more reliable prospect. People made calculations that failed them. She did not think harshly of Mrs. Pendry for that. She did find it curious, the particular confidence of someone who had never been overlooked, who perhaps did not know how to account for the possibility that what she expected might simply not materialize. She almost had the study. It was the 3rd week of February, a Thursday, and the Duke had gone to Keswick to call on Lord Pharaoh on some matter of local business that had been waiting since his return. He was expected back by 6. It was 2:30. Mrs. Holbrook was occupied with the inventory of the linen cupboards on the upper floor. Lettice climbed the stairs with a duster and a calm face. The study door was closed but not locked. The lock was only on the desk, not the room itself. She went in. The fire was banked but still giving off heat. The campaign desk stood against the wall to the left of the window, solid dark mahogany with brass fittings, and the lower right drawer had the small lock she remembered. She set down a duster and took the key from inside the hem of her dress, where she had kept it for 8 months in a small paper fold. Her father had given it to her. Not intentionally, He had left it on the tray in the entrance hall 2 days before he died, when he was already too unwell to come downstairs, and she had picked it up and put it in her pocket with the thought that she would bring it up to him. She had not, in the end. He had died on the Tuesday. She had kept the key. She had not known why, at first. Then she had. She put the key into the lock. It turned, the door opened, and she looked inside, and there was a leather folder, and she took it out with hands that were very steady, because she did not allow them to be otherwise, and she opened it. There was a document inside. She read the first page, then the second. She was still reading when she heard footsteps on the stairs. She had no time to put the folder back. She had time only to close the drawer and stand up and turn around. And then the door opened, and the Duke of Halverton walked in, still in his traveling coat, 7 minutes past 3, returned 2.5 hours earlier than expected. He stopped when he saw her, the leather folder in both her hands. She stood very. His eyes went to the folder, then to her face. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and felt considerably longer. "What," he said, "is that?" She had thought about this moment, had imagined it, had rehearsed it, had planned for the possibility. She had prepared a version of the truth that was partial and careful and designed to make a quiet exit possible. She had prepared it, but standing here now, in the room where her father had sat at this desk and told her she would be looked after, she found that she did not want to use it. "It is a will," she said. "My father's will. The one that was drafted in March of 1817 before the document that was produced after his death." Silence. "My name is Lettice Ashborne," she said. "I am the natural daughter of Charles Ashborne, who owned Thornvale House from 1891 until his death last April. The will your cousin Mr. Thatch produced named him as sole heir. This document," she held it up slightly, "precedes that one by 2 years, and it names me." The Duke looked at her. His face gave very little away. She did not know if this was a good sign or a poor one. "You have been here since November," he said. "Yes, working as a house assistant, under the name of Miss Lorne." She made herself hold his gaze. "I know that I should have approached the matter differently. I know what I have done in coming here as I did. I am not asking you to overlook it. I am asking only that you consider what is in that folder." He crossed the room. He held out his hand, and she gave him the folder. He stood near the window and read in silence for a long time, and she stood near the desk and did not move. When he looked up, his expression had changed. Not dramatically. Something had shifted in it the way a room shifts when the light changes. "This is your father's hand," he said. He said it as a statement, not a question. "Yes, I knew your father." He paused. "Not well. We spoke, perhaps 5 or 6 times. He was a man who chose his words carefully." He looked at the document again. "This is," he stopped. "Thatch has been in York since the spring. He has not made any alterations to the property, I understand. He removed several pieces of furniture," Lettice said, "and the portrait from the upper hall, but nothing structural." He looked at her. "You were watching." "I was watching," she said. Another pause. A longer one. She could hear the clock on the mantel, which she had wound herself last Wednesday. "You have been living here," he said, "in this house for 3 months, doing the work of a house assistant, waiting for an opportunity to recover a document that should by rights have protected you, while the house was occupied by a tenant whose presence made that access unavailable." He said this slowly, as though he were laying stones in a row and examining the pattern. "Alone." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he looked away, out the window, toward the drive. His jaw moved slightly. When he turned back, something had resolved in his face into something she could not quite name, but it was not unkind. "Sit down, Miss Ashborne," he said. "I think you ought to tell me the full account." She told him. She told him about the lawyers, about Mr. Thatch and his satisfied expression in the entrance hall, about the weeks she had spent trying to engage a solicitor of her own, about the three who had told her, in varying degrees of gentleness, that a challenge to a probated will was a costly and uncertain undertaking without documentary evidence to support it. She told him about the conversation with her father at the campaign desk, about the key left on the tray, about the 8 months she had spent considering her options, and finding that they narrowed always to the same single corridor. He listened without interrupting. This was unusual in her experience. Men generally interrupted. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Thatch's document," he said. "The probated one. Do you know how it came to supersede this? I believe my father was encouraged to update his testament in the weeks before his death when he was not well. I cannot prove that yet. But the dates suggest it. The document they produced was signed in the October before he died. His health had been declining since August. He was not himself in those final months." He looked at the folder again. Thatch was in York in October. He was, so he would have required an agent here, someone local. He turned a page. "I know several of your father's solicitors. I can make inquiries if you will permit me." She went very still. "You would do that?" He met her eyes. "Miss Ashborne, a woman has been sleeping in my servants' quarters and carrying linens up my back stairs for 3 months because no one thought to properly protect what was rightfully hers." He closed the folder. "It is the least complicated thing I have been asked to concern myself with since I returned." She felt, in that moment, something give way in her chest, like ice in the early spring when the ground has been hard so long that you forget it was ever otherwise. It was not a pleasant sensation exactly, but it was real. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "Thank me when it's resolved." He set the folder on the desk. "In the meantime, I will speak to Mrs. Holbrook. You need not continue in the current arrangement." "I would prefer," she said, and stopped. He waited. "I would prefer to remain," she said, "until the matter is settled, if that can be managed. I am more used to myself here than I would be elsewhere, and," she looked at the folder, "it would be difficult to explain my departure to Mr. Thatch's people without revealing that something has changed." He considered this. "You are suggesting that your continued presence here, in this capacity, is strategically preferable." "I am suggesting that Mr. Thatch does not know I have found what I was looking for," she said, "and that advantages tend to diminish once they become known." He was quiet for a moment, and then, for the first time since she had met him in any guise, he almost smiled. Not quite, not fully, but the corners of his mouth moved, and his eyes shifted. "Strategically preferable," he repeated. "Yes, very well," he said, "for now." It took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of quiet inquiry, of letters exchanged between the Duke's solicitor in London and her father's former man of business in the village, of documents produced and compared and deposed upon, of one afternoon when a man arrived from York who was not quite Mr. Thatch, and met with the Duke in the study for an hour and a half, and left again with his hat held tightly in both hands. The Duke told her each development without flourish, in the same tone he might use to relate matters of estate business. She appreciated this. She had had enough of people delivering significant information with dramatic expressions. During those 6 weeks, she continued to carry linens and wind clocks and take her meals at the long kitchen table. She and the Duke had a kind of understanding that required very little maintenance. A brief exchange in the corridor when he had something to report, a nod in passing, the occasional moment in the study in the early evening when she reviewed whatever document needed reviewing and he worked at the desk. She began, without meaning to know the particular sounds of him, the particular cadence of his work. The way he turned pages, she knew when he was deep in thought and when he had reached a point in his correspondence that displeased him. She did not examine this too carefully. She thought, sometimes, about Mrs. Pendry, about the woman who had arrived twice more in the intervening weeks, had sat in the drawing room, had left each time in a carriage that departed with a particular briskness, as though the vehicle itself had absorbed the mood of its passenger. She thought about what it must cost to reach for something you had already released, and find that it had moved on without waiting for you. Mrs. Pendry was, in the end, irrelevant to the practical matter at hand. But she occupied a place in Lettice's thinking that was something like a lesson she had not decided how to apply. The settlement arrived on a Friday morning in late March, in a letter that was brought to the study while Lettice happened to be there. Reviewing the final version of the probate challenge with the Duke's solicitor, a careful man named Mr. Orville, who smelled of cedar and had the apologetic manner of someone who spent his life delivering complicated news. Thatch had conceded, not graciously. The letter from his representatives made it clear he considered himself an injured party, and she suspected he had been advised that contesting further would only compound what was already an unflattering situation. But he had conceded. The original will stood. Thornvale House and the associated property reverted to Lettice Ashborne, named therein as sole heir. Mr. Orville shook her hand and said, "Congratulations, Miss Ashborne," and meant it, she thought. When he was gone, she stood in the study and looked out the window at the drive, at the beech trees that were beginning, tentatively, to come back into leaf. She had looked at those trees from the morning room window as a child. She had climbed the one on the left when she was 9 years old and torn her dress quite badly and been unable to explain the full extent of the damage to her governess. She heard the Duke's step in the corridor. He came in, looked at her face, and she saw him register whatever was in it. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. "Orville told me in the hall." He came and stood beside her at the window. Not close, a polite distance, the appropriate distance for two people who had arrived at a situation that was not quite anything that had a ready name. "How are you?" She considered the question. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I think it will take a little time to know." He nodded, as though this were a reasonable answer, which it was, she supposed, for him. He was someone who knew about returning to places, about the gap between the moment you recovered something and the moment you understood what it meant to have it back. She looked at the beech trees and thought about her father, about the drawer and the key and the 8 months and the gray dress that still did not fit properly. She thought about the front door, which was hers again now. "I owe you a considerable debt," she said. "You owe me nothing," he said. "You found the document. You held your position for 3 months without breaking. You argued your own case clearly when it was required." He paused. "I only made some inquiries. The inquiries mattered. Then I am glad to have made them." She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her. And there was something in his expression that was quiet and particular. The way the house was particular when most of it was asleep. "I shall have to move back into the house properly," she said. "That will require some adjustment." "I expect it will," he said. "You are welcome to remain, of course, for as long as the arrangement suits you." She hesitated. "Thornvale it is a large house for one person. It was always meant for more than one." He said nothing for a moment. The light through the window was the particular pale gold of a March afternoon, the kind that doesn't promise warmth but suggests it's being considered. "I think," he said carefully, "that I have been in some difficulty about what to do with myself since I returned. I went abroad because I needed to be somewhere that did not carry expectations. And then I came back because—" He stopped, looked at the trees. "One comes back," he said. "That is all. One finds eventually that one has run out of distance." She understood this. She thought she understood it rather well. "Thornvale," she said, "has no expectations of you." He looked at her again. Something shifted. The same shift she had seen in his face the day she had stood in this room with the folder in her hands except that this time it had somewhere further to go. "No," he said after a moment. "I don't suppose it does." They stood there a little longer, the two of them, in the study with the fire ticking low and the beech trees going tentatively green outside, and it was not quite anything yet. Not anything that could be named or arranged or set in writing. But it was the beginning of something, and she thought, for the first time in a long time, that beginnings were things she could work with.